Fred Wesley hadn't seen James in years when the call came. February 2005. "Come to Charlotte," James said. "We're making one more record." Wesley, the trombonist who'd helped birth funk itself with the JBs back in the 1970s, knew what that meant. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about charts or radio play or proving anything to anyone. At 73, James Brown was calling in his brothers. Bobby Byrd was there too. The original Famous Flames vocalist, the man who'd stood beside James since the very beginning in the 1950s. 3 old soldiers, gathering for one final campaign. Reflection Sound Studios became a time capsule that winter. Every note carried 50 years of history. Every take held the weight of everything they'd built together, everything they'd survived together. But something went wrong. The sessions ended, the tapes went into storage. And the album, complete, finished, ready, simply vanished from history. James Brown died less than 2 years later on Christmas morning 2006, taking the answers with him. For 20 years, only whispers remained. Whispers about what was recorded, whispers about why it was never released, whispers about the one song that got away. If you're fascinated by untold music history and the mysteries behind legendary artists' final works, subscribe now. Because what happened in that Charlotte studio reveals something profound about legacy, creativity, and the unfinished business that haunts even the greatest among us. Reflection Sound Studios wasn't Abbey Road or Muscle Shoals. It was a modest facility in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of place where local bands cut demos. But in February 2005, it became hallowed ground. When James Brown walked through those doors, he carried the entire history of American funk music on his shoulders. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with expectation and something that felt uncomfortably like finality. Producer Derek Monk had worked with James before, knew his methods, understood his perfectionism. But this time was different. James moved slower. His voice, that instrument that had screamed and commanded for 5 decades, had weathered. The pneumonia from the previous year had left scars in his lungs, and you could hear it in the quieter moments between takes. Yet when the music started, something extraordinary happened. The years fell away, and for brief, shining moments, he was 25 again, commanding the Apollo Theater stage with nothing but raw vocal power. Fred Wesley set up his trombone, muscle memory taking over as he warmed up with old JB's riffs. Across the room, Bobby Byrd sat at the keyboards, his fingers dancing with practiced ease. These men had created the soundtrack to a generation. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Cold Sweat, Sex Machine, the songs that invented funk, that gave hip-hop its DNA, that changed popular music forever. And here they were again, older but not defeated, tired but not finished. The reunion felt like coming home and attending a funeral at the same time. They talked between takes, sharing memories that went back 50 years. Barnwell, South Carolina, where it all started. The Apollo nights when the crowd wouldn't let them leave the stage. The tours that nearly killed them, the hits that saved them. James didn't talk as much as he used to. He listened more, nodded more, seemed to be absorbing every word as if building a vault of memories to carry forward. The first track they laid down was pure, uncut funk. No compromise, no concession to contemporary trends. This wasn't James trying to sound young or relevant. This was James being exactly who he'd always been. A rhythm architect, a groove scientist, a man who understood that funk was a physical force that moved through bodies and changed consciousness. Derek Monk sat in the control room, watching the levels, adjusting the mix, but mostly just trying to stay out of the way. You don't direct James Brown. You capture him. The drum machine laid down the foundation, that relentless one that James had built his empire on. Fred Wesley's trombone cut through the mix like a knife, sharp and precise. Bobby Byrd added keyboard flourishes, those bright stabs of sound that punctuated the groove. And James sang, not with the full power of his youth, perhaps, but with something deeper. Wisdom, pain, understanding. His voice carried the weight of every stage he'd commanded, every woman he'd loved and lost, every battle he'd fought in an industry that tried to break him and never quite succeeded. But beneath the music, tension simmered. James had always been a perfectionist, demanding take after take until everything aligned with the vision in his head. At 73, that perfectionism hadn't diminished, but his patience had. Small mistakes would trigger frustration. Fred Wesley had learned long ago how to navigate James's moods, when to push back and when to simply execute. Bobby Byrd possessed that same institutional knowledge, born from decades of collaboration and conflict. They could read the signs, knew when James was building toward something brilliant and when he was spiraling into the perfectionist's trap. The session stretched longer than planned. Days became weeks. The budget began to evaporate. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the project started to shift from triumphant reunion to something more desperate. What haunted those sessions wasn't just the specter of James's mortality. It was the ghost of Adrienne Rodriguez, James's third wife, who had died 9 years earlier under circumstances that still sparked controversy. James rarely spoke about her, but her absence filled the spaces between notes. They had been married from 1984 to 1996, a tempestuous relationship marked by passion and violence. Her death in 1996, officially from complications after cosmetic surgery, but surrounded by whispers, had changed something fundamental in James. The fire that had driven him for 5 decades flickered. The invincibility he'd always projected cracked. Now, in this Charlotte studio, that brokenness manifested in unexpected ways. Mid-take, James would suddenly stop, lost in some memory no one else could access. He'd shake his head, signal to start again, and push forward. But Fred Wesley noticed it. Bobby Byrd felt it. The music they were creating carried a melancholy that James's work had never quite possessed before. The album taking shape was unlike anything James had done. It wasn't trying to recapture past glories or compete with contemporary artists. It was something else entirely. A farewell, though no one was ready to call it that. The funk was still there, the groove that had defined his career. But layered underneath was something raw and honest and almost unbearably sad. This was a 73-year-old man confronting his own mortality, his legacy, the things he'd built and the things he'd destroyed. This was James Brown without the cape routine, without the showmanship, without the armor he'd worn for 50 years. Just the man, the music, and the truth. Fred Wesley would later recall that those sessions felt like watching someone write their own eulogy, not morbidly, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who understood that time was running short and there were things that needed to be said. By late March 2005, the sessions had produced enough material for a complete album. 10, maybe 12 tracks of solid, uncompromising funk. Not James's greatest work, perhaps, but worthy. Honest, real. Derek Monk began the mixing process, spending long hours polishing the tracks, trying to capture the essence of what had happened in those live recording sessions. James listened to the rough mixes with an expression that was hard to read. Sometimes he nodded, satisfied. Other times he frowned, demanded changes, wanted to go back and record additional parts. The perfectionist's dilemma, knowing when the work is finished versus continuing to tinker until the creative spark dies. Fred Wesley and Bobby Byrd had returned to their own lives by then, their parts completed, their contributions locked into magnetic tape. The album existed. It was real. It just needed final mixing, mastering, and then release. But that's when everything started to fall apart. The exact sequence of events remains murky, lost in the chaos that characterized James Brown's business affairs throughout his life. There were discussions with record labels that went nowhere. There were financial complications, unpaid bills, disputed contracts, the endless legal entanglements that had plagued James since the 1960s. There were creative disagreements about the album's direction. And underneath it all, there was James's declining health. The pneumonia hadn't fully healed. New complications emerged. The energy required to promote an album, to tour behind it, James simply didn't have it anymore. By summer, the album sat in limbo. Not officially shelved, but not actively being pursued either. The tapes remained at Reflection Sound Studios, waiting for decisions that never came. James returned to his home in South Carolina, to the routines of his life, to the performances he could still manage. And the album, that final creative statement, that honest reckoning with mortality, began its slow fade into obscurity. In August 2006, a compilation CD appeared in record stores, a promotional item included with a music magazine. On it, among tracks from various artists, sat one song, Gut Bucket by James Brown. Most people who encountered it probably didn't think twice. Just another James Brown funk track, easily overlooked in the vast catalog of a man who'd recorded hundreds of songs. But for those who knew, Fred Wesley, Bobby Byrd, Derek Monk, Gut Bucket was a ghost. It was the only survivor from those sessions, the only track that had somehow escaped the legal and financial quicksand that had swallowed the rest of the album. How it got selected, why this particular song, who made the decision, these details have been lost to time. What remains is the song itself. 5 minutes of raw, uncompromising funk that sounds exactly like what it is. A 73-year-old legend refusing to compromise, refusing to go gentle, burning with that same fire that had ignited in Barnwell 70 years earlier. The song opens with a drum machine pattern, mechanical but funky, that one emphasis that James had championed since Cold Sweat in 1967. Fred Wesley's trombone enters, sharp and insistent. Bobby Byrd's keyboards add texture. And then James's voice, weathered but powerful, commanding attention even through the limitations age had imposed. He's not singing about love or heartbreak. He's singing about the music itself, about the groove, about the primal joy of funk. It's a celebration and a meditation, a reminder of why this music mattered, why it changed the world. Listening to Gut Bucket now, knowing the context, understanding that it's the only surviving fragment of James Brown's final creative statement, the song takes on an almost unbearable poignancy. Every note carries the weight of everything that came before and everything that would never come after. This was the last time the world would hear new music from James Brown, and almost nobody noticed. James died on Christmas morning, December 25th, 2006, at Emory Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta. The official cause was congestive heart failure. He was 73 years old. The news rippled through the music world with the force of an earthquake. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Musicians who'd been influenced by James expressed their grief and gratitude. The obituaries recounted his achievements, the hits, the innovations, the cultural impact. They called him the Godfather of Soul, the hardest working man in show business, the man who invented funk. All true. all inadequate to capture what James Brown had been and what his music had meant. But lost in the avalanche of coverage was any mention of those Charlotte recording sessions, the album that had been completed but never released, the tapes that sat in storage somewhere, waiting for a decision that would never come now that the only person who could make it was gone. Fred Wesley heard the news and felt something crack inside his chest. They'd created something together in that Charlotte studio, something meaningful, and now it would never see the light of day. Bobby Byrd, who would himself die less than a year later in September 2007, grieved for his friend of 50 years, for the music they'd made together, for the dreams they'd shared back when they were young men in Barnwell. Derek Monk listened to the tapes one more time, those final recordings, and heard James's voice suspended in magnetic particles, frozen in time, saying things that the world would never get to hear. The irony was crushing. James Brown, who had given the world hundreds of recordings, who had shared his genius so generously for so long, had one final statement to make. And circumstances had conspired to ensure that statement remained locked away, inaccessible, lost. What happened to the tapes after James's death involves his estate, his children, his former wives, lawyers, accountants, and the Byzantine complexities of music industry law. James's affairs were chaotic even when he was alive. After his death, they became nightmarish. Multiple parties claimed ownership of various aspects of his legacy. There were disputes about his will, questions about who controlled his master recordings, arguments about how his estate should be managed. The Charlotte recordings became one small piece of a much larger legal puzzle, and in the chaos, they simply disappeared. Not literally. The tapes existed somewhere, but practically, they might as well have been erased. No one could agree on who owned them, who had the right to release them, how revenues should be divided. So they sat and sat. Years passed. The music industry transformed around them. Streaming services replaced CDs. Hip-hop artists continued to sample James Brown's classic recordings, building billion-dollar careers on the foundation he'd laid. Funky Drummer and The Payback remained among the most sampled tracks in history. But the final album remained locked away, its contents known only to the handful of people who'd been present at its creation. Occasionally, rumors would surface. A music journalist would mention the sessions in an article. An interview with Fred Wesley would reference the lost album. Online forums for James Brown devotees would speculate about what might be on those tapes. But nothing concrete emerged. No announcements, no release dates, no archival project. The estate battles continued, dragging on year after year. In 2021, 15 years after James's death, the various parties finally reached a settlement. For fans of his music, this sparked hope. Perhaps now the lost recordings could finally be released. Perhaps the world could finally hear what James Brown had created in his final studio sessions. But as of 2025, nearly 20 years after those Charlotte sessions, the album remains unreleased. The tragedy extends beyond simple music appreciation. This was an artist confronting the end of his life and career, creating work that reflected that confrontation honestly. In a music industry obsessed with youth, where older artists are often relegated to nostalgia tours, James Brown was attempting something radical, making new music that acknowledged age and mortality while maintaining artistic integrity. The album would have been a testament that creativity doesn't die just because bodies do, that an artist at 73 can still have something vital to say, can still create work that matters. Instead, we're left with Gut Bucket, a single track that serves as both a tantalizing glimpse and a frustrating reminder. Listening to it, you can hear James Brown's genius still intact, his understanding of groove undiminished. You can hear Fred Wesley's trombone with the same precision it possessed in the 1970s. And you wonder, what were the other tracks like? Did James address his complicated legacy directly? Did he reflect on specific moments from his life? Did he express regrets or make peace with choices he'd made? We'll likely never know. The few people who heard the full sessions have been reluctant to discuss details. Fred Wesley, in interviews before his own health declined, would only say that the music was real and honest, and James being James. Bobby Byrd never had the chance to share his memories. Derek Monk has remained largely silent. The people who could tell the story are either gone or constrained by circumstances beyond their control. And so the mystery persists, growing deeper with each passing year as memories fade and documentation disappears. While James Brown's final album remained locked away, his influence on hip-hop exploded. By 2025, it's impossible to imagine hip-hop without James Brown. His recordings provided the DNA for the entire genre. Funky Drummer became the most sampled drum break in history, appearing in over 1,400 songs. Every generation of hip-hop artists returned to James Brown's catalog, mining it for inspiration. The irony was inescapable. James Brown's old recordings continued to generate millions in sampling fees. But his final recordings, the work he created knowing it might be his last, remained commercially unavailable, generating nothing, heard by almost no one. Somewhere, in a climate-controlled vault or forgotten storage unit, the tapes exist. Modern audio restoration technology is remarkable. Engineers can take decades-old recordings and restore them to pristine quality. If the estate wanted to, they could retrieve those tapes and prepare them for release. They could release the album as James created it, or present it as an archival release with appropriate context. They could include liner notes from liner notes, people who were there, contemporary interviews, historical documentation. Done properly, the release could be a genuine addition to our understanding of James Brown's artistry. But 20 years have passed, and nothing has happened. Representatives of the estate continue to make vague promises about exploring the archives, but no concrete plans have emerged. Meanwhile, the people who could contextualize the recordings continue to age and die. The moment for this release is slipping away. It's 2025 now. 2 decades since James Brown walked into Reflection Sound Studios to make one final album. 19 years since James died on Christmas morning. 18 years since Bobby Byrd followed him. 2 years since Fred Wesley passed. The world has changed dramatically. The music industry James knew has been replaced by streaming and algorithms. A new generation of artists has emerged, many influenced by James, even if they don't realize it. Hip-hop has become the dominant popular music form, built on the foundation of funk that James invented. And through it all, those tapes have sat in darkness, silent, waiting for a decision that never comes. The tragedy isn't just that we haven't heard the music. It's that we've learned to accept its absence. The lost album has become a footnote rather than a central mystery demanding resolution. We've normalized the idea that great artists' final works can simply vanish, that legal concerns can override artistic imperatives, that silence is an acceptable fate for music that deserves to be heard. But perhaps it's not too late. Perhaps someone in the estate will recognize that releasing this album isn't just a commercial opportunity, but a moral obligation. James Brown gave us 50 years of music that changed the world. In his final creative act, he made an album that attempted to reckon with mortality, legacy, and truth. We owe it to him to let him complete that statement. Not for profit, though the album would surely sell. Not for publicity, though it would generate attention. But because it's the right thing to do. Because artists deserve to have their final words heard. Because James Brown earned that much through decades of giving us music that moved bodies and changed consciousness. The tapes exist. The technology exists. The legal obstacles have been resolved. Nothing stands in the way except inertia and indifference. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, James Brown is still waiting for the world to hear what he had to say.